So for those of us, for those of you who don't know the Digital Poverty Alliance, I'm Elizabeth. I'm the Chief Exec over here. And we are a charitable coalition, and we bring together government, we bring together business, and we bring together other charities and community-led groups with the aim of ending digital poverty once and for all by 2030. Digital poverty, we class as being whenever an individual can't access digital services, how, when, and where they want to. So this is all about breaking down affordability, breaking down skills barriers, and also ensuring people have the choice and the trust to be able to use online services in a way that is going to work for them. I'm delighted that today we have Charlotte Walshe with us. Charlotte, could I just ask you to briefly introduce yourself?
Absolutely, and thank you for having me, Elizabeth. I'd love to. It's always nice seeing the number of attendees dropping in on the side as you're kind of looking along. But I'm the Partnerships and Impact Director at In-Kind Direct. Been there about 6 years. I'm also a very proud ambassador of Digital Poverty Alliance and sit on the National Delivery Committee for you guys as well.
Oh, fantastic. And today we're going to be talking about navigating impact, measuring social change in the fight against poverty. Just before we get going, if you are joining us live today, we would love you to put in the chat who you are, what organisation you represent, where in the country or even the world you might be. And if you have any questions as we go through, there's a little Q&A button down at the bottom of the screen. Do use that, and then we will come to as many as possible of those questions towards the end of the session. But just to kick us off, Charlotte, could you tell us a little bit more about In-Kind Direct, what they do, what you get up to, and also how that ties in with digital poverty specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. So In-Kind Direct has been around since the late 90s. We were set up by the now King, very much as an environmental organisation to reduce the amount of products that were going into landfill and going to waste, and to unlock a lot of the social good that could be done with those consumer goods. And when I talk about products, we mean pretty much anything that an individual, a household, or a local organisation needs for people to live well and to deliver their services. So really think hygiene, tech, office supplies, household goods, clothing, books, toys, games, the whole range of things, pretty much anything except fresh food. And when I think about In-Kind Direct, I would say for the first 22-ish years of our life, that product distribution, that getting donated product from manufacturers and retailers out through an amazing network of local charities, food banks, community groups, schools, places of worship, has been the totality of our model. We're pretty good at it. We distribute about 50,000 orders a year from our central warehouse out to about 6,000 local organisations. But when we came through the pandemic, into the cost of living crisis, if we can call it a crisis anymore, cost of living situation, and 10 plus years of austerity measures, we recognise that we will always work to alleviate immediate need by getting those products into the hands of people that need them. But if that's all we do as an organisation, then the problem isn't going away, and the reasons, the underlying causes why millions of people are forced to rely on a service like ours isn't going to change. So a second strand of work, which was focused on really using the phenomenal evidence and stories from that network I mentioned, commissioning new research, delivering public campaigns, working with our partners like Digital Poverty Alliance, like all the companies that we work with, was really going to be necessary to both meet the immediate need and to start looking at those systemic reasons why so many people are going without. And when I think about the causes that we work across, we're so proud that we work with pretty much any charitable constituted organisation, whoever they're working with in the UK, for whatever cause, for whatever reason. But there are particular things and particular groups that have been disproportionately affected by those negative situations I've mentioned. So we particularly focus on working with smaller charitable organisations, tackling hygiene poverty, which is going without those fundamental essentials to keep clean and well. Children's right to be children, children's right to play, for their parents not to be anxious, to be able to have their own book, to be able to engage at school, and also getting people online, which is quite an underpinning piece, which I'm sure we'll cover through this conversation. But that's where our kind of contribution to digital inclusion really comes through, is in that fourth piece. So hopefully that gives people a sense of what we're doing. And I wouldn't be doing my job, and our charity network manager would be furious with me if I didn't mention and plug, please, if you're a charitable organisation that uses products to run your services, to manage your properties, to give to people you support, please head to our website, inkinddirect.org, and register for free.
Fantastic. I imagine we've probably lost a few attendees to Google right now, not finding that website. And thank you to Emily, who's just posted that link in the chat. And that is a really important point. It's not just the help right now, it is changing that underlying systemic piece around actually how we deal with poverty and how we are able to address creating an environment where people don't need to rely on this kind of support. But unfortunately, I suspect we are a long way off hitting the point where actually we have a truly fair and equitable society, even in the UK. I imagine that in Kind Direct, you will have observed a lot of interconnectedness between those different facets of poverty, whether that's digital, whether it's hygiene, as you mentioned, fuel, food. Can you provide some examples of maybe what you've seen in terms of addressing one aspect of poverty and how that has really positively influenced other areas of lives?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that interconnectedness, that word you used, is absolutely key, because, and I think, Elizabeth, you and I have even had this conversation before, if there is, you can talk about the specifics and the impacts and the particular prevalence of fuel poverty, of food poverty, hygiene poverty, of digital poverty. But at the end of the day, the crossover between people who are experiencing one and experiencing more than one is huge. But it just means people don't have what they need to live well. And that's what it boils down to. So we know when we speak to our network, about 75% of the people they're supporting are basically foregoing hygiene products like toothpaste, like toilet roll, to be able to put food on the table. We know that people who are hit by an unexpected expense, like the oven breaking, the fridge going, a laptop breaking, a phone dying, will forego other things to be able to access that. And it's to do with the total amount of spare income, for want of a better phrase. And that's not just affecting those at the lowest end of the income levels. We're seeing it affecting more and more people. So we know that when you look at who uses a food bank, yes, there is a huge number of people on universal credit who are on lower incomes or who are unemployed using that service. But about half the people going into a food bank are privately renting, are paying a mortgage, are in full-time employment. So this is something that's a much broader, unfortunately, it's a bit of a levelling situation that we're seeing now. So one of the pieces of work we did back in 2022, we published a piece of work called The Human Right to Hygiene, which was a bit of a systems mapping exercise. So it stepped back and said, okay, what are the reasons, what are the cycles of behaviour, the cycles of disadvantage that put people in a position to be experiencing hygiene poverty? And we worked with a really phenomenal mix of other charities, companies, and public bodies to make sure it wasn't us in an echo chamber, that we were getting a really full insight. And sadly, what we saw is a huge amount of overlap, that causes of hygiene poverty are very similar to the causes of other forms of going without, and that they exacerbate each other. So when you're thinking about someone trying to access benefit support or guidance, or even be able to know which local charities they should go to access support, if you don't have a computer, if you don't have data, if you can't get online, you are automatically at a disadvantage for those things. I've seen some of the amazing work that DPA has done around the majority of jobs are advertised online, the majority of benefits are accessed online. There is a greater push for education to be delivered online. So you start to see how actually, if you're in a situation where maybe you're going without some of those fundamental hygiene supplies, you're embarrassed to go to school, maybe you're missing school, you're not then having those opportunities to train, to develop, to access the skills, including digital skills that you need. You're growing up in a home where going without is the norm, is seen as okay. You may not understand there's an issue till you're interacting with other social groups. And then you start trying to apply for jobs to access the support you need. And you start to see how these things have a compounding impact. So you don't have the ability to access the best deals. We know there's a commonality between being able to get online and how rural a location you live in, which also maps with the difference between major supermarkets and their local branches, which will have a higher price point. So you start to see how all these things perpetuate each other. But what I love about the work that In Kind Direct and so many other organisations on this call, I'm sure, do, is providing that bit of hope of, yes, there is this situation, and yes, these things are all connected, but there are absolutely points where you can break those cycles, where you can intervene and improve someone's life chances. Giving someone a laptop is so much more than just letting them get online. It's allowing them autonomy and choice and the ability to develop and have the opportunities that everyone should access. So for me, the interconnectedness is fundamental, and it's not, you don't fix digital poverty in one way. You'll be fixing a lot of other things, and you'll be helping people to live well ultimately.
And I mean, digital poverty is such a complex system. There are so many facets, there are so many different pillars that sit around that. And when you think about how that does intersect with all of the other types of poverty that people are facing, and I'm really interested to hear you pick up on that point around people living in rural areas. We also see it a lot in coastal areas that they're not a big city location. You don't necessarily have as much support, and you can't see the opportunities as clearly as you might be able to see them in some city centre locations. So actually, for us, we feel like having that online access, that can be the window to opportunities, to understanding what, if there is such a thing as normal, what normal might look like, what aspiration might look like. But for so many families, that's just not a reality they can even consider vaguely. It really is something that sits as being fundamental to all other forms of poverty.
And it's where you start to see the roles of organisations like local charities, like schools, like libraries, to provide that infrastructure that people may not be able to access in their own home, or may not even be aware that they're missing out on. And a lot of the work we do, when we come back to making recommendations from a policy position or evidencing the work we're doing, is really celebrating and amplifying the role that local charitable organisations can play in the mix of being that point of contact, of being that point of support for so many people, particularly in more rural areas. So it completely resonates what you're saying there, Elizabeth.
And of course, it's so important because they are trusted, but we must not take those charities for granted, because they do a huge amount of work, often on incredibly low budgets. So clearly, there's a huge amount that In-Kind Direct is tackling here. How have you gone about effectively really measuring the social impact of your initiatives, particularly for us in the context of addressing digital poverty, but also some of that wider piece as well?
Absolutely. And I think what's really special about In-Kind Direct and a lot of other infrastructure bodies is we have these two layers of impact. So there's the impact we're having for the local organisations in our network. Exactly as you said, there is an increase in need, there is a reduction in funding, there is a need for a greater variety of services, people are experiencing more complex needs. So when we look at the work we do by distributing out donated product and the savings we can unlock, so last year, distributing out the product that we did to our network, we saved that group £26 million, which meant they could either effectively reinvest that money they didn't have to spend elsewhere in paying more staff, training volunteers, delivering new services, reaching new audiences, or they could support more people. So we know that through providing product to our network, on average, they're supporting 50% more people with the product that they need by working with us. So there's some really distinct impacts that we can capture, both numerical, but also what that actually means to an organisation in terms of their own resilience, in terms of their own sustainability at that level of network partners. And then, of course, there's the communities, the families, the individuals that they're supporting, which is generally what we think about when we think about social impact. But that network or safety net for organisations there is absolutely huge. And at the moment, we're supporting about 445,000 people a week through that phenomenal network to access the product that they need. So we have these two layers of impact. And so one of the things we did, again, back in 2022, which was a year of investment for us, was our 20th anniversary. So we unlocked a nice little research budget for me and my team to have some fun with, which was great. We did another piece of work when we called it More Than Product. And it was a bit of a cost benefit analysis, which is, if we spend this money doing something, will it actually have an increased benefit for the people we're trying to reach? And so we went through a bit of a process of, okay, what are the key outcomes that we achieve for our network? What's the value of In-Kind Direct being in the mix? and almost, would it be better if we weren't here? And the conclusion was, no, actually we add quite a lot of value to what we're doing. So roughly speaking, every £1 that's spent by In-Kind Direct doing what we do unlocks about £14 of social value across the UK. So we've got a whole process and a programme, and what we feel really strongly about it In-Kind Direct is not only is the final project report published, but so are the surveys, the methodology, the approach that we took to do that. So anyone else that wants to start looking at that approach, a bit of a theory of change, cost benefit analysis piece, please go to our website and have a look at them, or the products report, because we haven't hidden anything, and it's kind of like, we've paid for it, so let's make it available to as many people as possible. But one of the key things that comes through a lot, and is particularly relevant for infrastructure charities, is the idea of attribution. So I would love to say to you that we gave a bottle of shampoo to this gentleman and he went on to get a job, and that's entirely because of that bottle of shampoo. But we all know that's slightly rubbish. So being able to attribute, okay, yes, we gave him an element of confidence. By being able to go to an organisation and access that shampoo, he accessed a wider range of services, which may have included something like digital skills. He was then supported to apply for roles. So we absolutely had a hand to play, and we talk a lot about basic products being a gateway to accessing other support. But the work that we did allowed us to actually lay claim to a relevant proportion of that impact, rather than trying to claim it all. So certainly we have internal KPIs that we work to, and we have a bit of a framework that we look at. Okay, we are a relatively small team for a UK charity. There's 35 of us delivering across the UK. Where are we going to put our effort? What are we going to do to be able to have impact and be able to measure it? And I think for me, when I just reflect personally, my background's in project management, and I've written a fair few business cases in my time. I remember getting a piece of advice really early on in my career that's always stuck with me. We can all tend to leap to the reasons why we are doing something and what it's going to achieve. But actually sometimes thinking about, well, what happens if we do nothing, gives you a really clear understanding of, oh, okay, well, that would be terrible, so we must do something. And almost going to the, what happens if we just don't do anything? Well, this would carry on, this would get worse, we wouldn't be able to do this. Suddenly you've kind of got the reverse business case for why you should be doing something. So I've always found that a really helpful guide for us. And you asked me specifically about digital poverty as well. So for example, we're always looking in In-Kind Direct for what we call triple win situations. So something that can help us, it will meet a need in our network and in the communities they're serving. It will be more sustainable, more cost effective, and it will meet a social need. So we'll be supporting our network, meeting a social need, and being more sustainable and cost effective as an organisation. And so for us, there was a piece around, well, we knew that more and more people needed to access a device, or needed to access more than one device in their home. But the cost of new devices was skyrocketing because of the availability of raw materials. But there were loads of really good devices that already existed in the world. So we launched a refurb tech project, which allowed us to combine those things. There was an increased need for devices. It would reduce cost to be able to get out something that was refurbished, and it would have a huge impact in terms of carbon footprint. So we were able to track the kind of the numbers. So last year we distributed 1,000 laptops. We were able, through some clever calculations of our sustainability manager, to say, well, that was the equivalent emissions of taking 3,000 cars off the road and turn it into something that people can go wow to. We were able to track how many people were accessing each device, what sorts of audiences they were going to, what it was supporting through speaking to our network. But then you always bring it back to a story. So we heard some amazing stories about, because we were a minimum spec of product that had a certain amount of software already installed, we heard about people with dyslexia being supported to be able to access the benefits and support they needed. We heard about small organisations with a lot of staff who were carers or parents who suddenly had the flexibility to work from home because they had their own laptop rather than coming to the office. So you start to be able to bring it to life in a way that means something to people. So we are always trying to track impact and to measure what we're doing. And in the context of digital poverty, that has its own challenges, but there's also some amazing stats and stories that you can capture.
And that's arguably always the question, what's going to have the most impact? And I don't know what you might have found at In-Kind Direct, because a lot of the time we find it's those big eye-catching statistics that sort of in some ways capture the interest, particularly of government, of industry. But actually people connect with people, they don't connect with numbers. And it's those stories that really do actually explain to people why, particularly in our case, digital poverty, why this matters, why digital isn't a luxury. What's your approach been to striking that balance and putting your energy in the right place to catch the right information when you're demonstrating that impact?
Yeah, I think that's a really fair question. And I think unsurprisingly, the answer is somewhere in the middle. It has to be a bit of both. We focus on the stats and the stories. And it's actually a phrase that we had an interim chief exec last year while our chief exec was on maternity leave. And he was always saying, no stats without a story, no stories without a stat. And it was always, that was our kind of ethos last year, and it was carried through. But we've definitely been on a journey as an organization. If I think back to 5-6 years ago, we were very good at talking about pallets of product and what had moved around the warehouse and how many miles it had traveled. And it was very, very number heavy about things that were quite kind of unemotive, basically. Whereas now we talk about, yes, we talk about volumes, and those big numbers help us in lots of ways, but we talk about the impact that it has for people. We talk about the difference it makes. So we talk very much about the why something matters, not just what we're doing. And also for us, it's really important that we capture where is in-kind direct adding the value. We aren't the one delivering the food bank service, delivering the counselling service. So where is it that we're adding value? And that's where, when we talk about our multiplier effect, so those savings that we unlock, that an organisation can spend far less with us and unlock far more product to reach more people, to do more. That's the value that we can add in, as well as reducing the amount of waste, encouraging companies to be more responsible, as an education piece around raising awareness of social issues that people may not always be aware of. And most importantly for us, reducing the shame that so many people feel, embarrassment they feel to go and seek that support if they need it. So we always try and strike a balance between the two and have a bit of both. We always talk about how do we humanize the big numbers? How do we connect issues to people, things that people care about? So again, when I think about the refurb tech, yes, we had a story about what it converted to in terms of kind of carbon emission equivalents. But I come back to the story, it still sits with me, a gentleman with dyslexia. So not only was he able to access support, but he could video call with his family. He could speak to people. And we know, as a general trend in the UK, families that used to live within a mile square of each other their whole life now live, across the UK and across the world. So that isolation and loneliness that so many people feel is exacerbated if there isn't a way to easily keep in touch with people. And I think ultimately what we do is we do a lot of testing. So I'm really keen that as a UK charity, we don't claim to have all the answers. We are as strong as, and the knowledge we have comes primarily from that network of over 6,000 local charities. So we have a phenomenal insights panel of about 150 of those organisations that we engage with monthly. We have a board that has a really strong blend of skills and experience across the corporate and the charitable sectors. We work with amazing sector partners like Digital Poverty Alliance and Learning Foundation. And we have, on average, any 1 year, over 100 companies working with us and donating product to us. So we test things. We test out the assets and the campaign slogans and the wording, and have we got the framing of this right? Is what we're saying inclusive? Is it respectful? Are there nuances that we won't be aware of? And we actively seek that feedback. So we're always testing, does this land? Does this amazing stat that seems brilliant to us actually encourage anyone to click through on social media to read the rest of the story? Does that story that we're telling respect the person that it's about? Have we got the language right? So I think it's always really important to have the blend, but to be proactive in, is it landing? Is it saying what we want it to say?
I love that stats, no stat without a story, and no story without a stat. I feel we might pinch that at the DPA. And you talked about that incredible network of 6,000 real on the ground community led organisations in the insights panel. How else do you actively engage with your stakeholders to really gather feedback on that social impact piece to really get under the skin of where that impact is happening?
Yeah, so absolutely, as you said, the network of charitable organisations is the key source of our feedback on that. And we do that through the insights panel I mentioned, but we also have 2 surveys to our network every year. So we the chance to engage with thousands of organisations and understand what's been important to them, what's important in the months coming ahead, the difference that we're making together. We also reach out actively to our network for specific stories. So if we're doing particular projects or working with particular brands, we'll hone in on getting particular feedback there. We do specific project initiatives. So I talked about the refurb tech as one example. Obviously, our organisations worked on the Tech for Schools project together. So we'll do specific project evaluation to understand the impact of those things. But we also overlay that with UK polling. So we have the ability to go out and say, okay, this is what's happening in our network. This is what we're seeing directly, but actually this is the wider trend that's being seen at a national level. So we're always bringing that back, and is what's happening in our network, does that feel unusual, or sadly, does it feel like what is being seen more generally? And then the other stakeholders that we work with would be our corporate partners that I've mentioned. And a lot of that comes down to, it's a piece I've always held close, is there's what you want to say and what you want to get across, but then there's also what someone else needs to hear and how they're going to hear it. And so there's a lot of work we do with, for our corporate partners in particular, what's their ambition, what's important to them, where are the gaps that they're trying to fill in having impact, where we can step in and provide support, and actually kind of blending those things together, because then you access all of their tracking, all of their impact measurement. Because if they're trying to achieve, so we work with corporates who might be trying to reach 1 billion people around the world for something, they are tracking that very closely. So if what we're doing can tie into what they're doing, they can do our impact assessment for us, and then we can provide them with the stories that their stats are going to be glaringly missing, and together we can add value for each other. So we're always having that sense check that the work we're doing and the work our partners are doing is aligned. And then similarly with our sector partners, it's that understanding. So we launched back in February a new piece of research specifically around period equity, and that's about having access to the support, the education, the healthcare and the products to manage menstrual health, which doesn't just affect women. It has a huge impact across society as a whole. And so we were very clear. We had a working group that was a mixture of charities and a couple of corporate partners. And we were very clear who's tracking what, who's looking after what have you done before? How can we map this? How could we do it differently? And really kind of pooling and sharing the data that was already there, because we were really keen. We didn't want to churn out another report that was kind of looking at the same stuff. So the first thing we did was almost a bit of a review of, okay, well, what data's out there? Where are the gaps? How old is some of that data? Okay, what do we need to fill in the gaps to reinforce the recommendations that are already out there? Because a lot of systems change work is, you're talking in terms of, I mean, at best years, more likely decades for change to happen. So if a bit of data is 10 years old, actually updating that information is just as helpful as going out and finding something new. So we were really keen that we weren't duplicating effort. No one in this sector has got the time to be duplicating effort. So really understanding where the gaps were and how we could fill them was really important to us. But the feedback loop for us is really important, whether that's within a project, whether that's ongoing with our network, whether it's bringing in new partners, or having a number of our corporate partners who've worked with us for over 20 years. So we're always seeking to, how can we do this differently? How can we bring it through? Are the stories and the information that we're providing delivering what they need it to? Because that's the huge role that we play as kind of a bit of a middle pole, is being that point of translation, that conduit of information between different audiences.
I suspect for many people that will be incredibly useful to hear. And yes, it is always the tension, isn't it, between what you want to tell people, all the fantastic things that you've done, that you want to get that information out there, versus actually what people want to read. I'm evidently one of the first things that I learned coming into sort of a stakeholder engagement career was that you have to tailor everything that you're saying to really meet the needs of your audience. But actually, particularly in small and medium-sized charities, that can be quite difficult, because it can be sort of tempting to go, well, we've got the story, people will take it the way they should, and that's not necessarily how that happens. And I'm sure that a lot of energy must go in at In-Kind Direct to really ensuring that you're pulling out either the policy piece, or the level of reporting that a funder might need, or really where you're able to demonstrate the impact of the organisation.
Yeah, so it's a blend of, it's two extremes of the spectrum, I guess, really, because you're absolutely right. There's a huge amount of tailoring, bespoke comms that goes in, particularly for our largest or our longest standing partners, where bluntly the effort is worth it. But we also work really hard, because we work in a very broad way with lots of different audiences. The majority of what we want to say should appeal to everyone. So there's kind of, it's this blend of, okay, where do we need to be super specific and super bespoke, but also actually the themes and the issues and the stories we're telling resonate with everyone. And that's why that shift to a more storytelling, a more people-led approach to impact allows it to have a far more universal kind of relevance. And a lot of what we do, because we work with so many different kinds of organizations, serving so many different communities, we aren't a kind of a single medical cause charity or a particular group of people. We are incredibly broad, which is a strength for us, but it can also be a challenge when it comes to comms. So a lot of what we do is finding the common ground. And Elizabeth, you will know me well enough by now to know that I cannot possibly have a conversation with anyone about in-kind direct and not mention toilet roll. And that is the number one product, even on a digital poverty seminar, webinar. Toilet roll is the great leveler. It is the most requested, the most needed product across our network, regardless of who they are working with, because everyone needs toilet roll. And it's one of those things where it's got just enough humor, a slight bit of, oh, that's quite personal, but it makes it real for people. If you talk to people about the scale of hygiene poverty or the scale of digital poverty or the millions of products that are needed to turn the tide or the huge policy recommendations that's required in the next 10 years, or you just talk to people about, can you imagine getting up in the morning and not being able to brush your teeth and not being able to wash your hair, and you can't check the train times before you head to the station because you run out of data, and you're going to have to run out of the house probably wearing yesterday's clothes that you've not washed. Like, how are you feeling going into the day? Suddenly someone doesn't need to understand the nuances in the stat. That would be terrible. That would be awful. What can I do? And that can lead into a very different conversation quite quickly. So yes, we do tailor content, but we're also always looking for that universal language. And also, I'm a firm believer in where there's the right word for something, use it, and actually use our position to educate people on the language that the people affected are comfortable and feel is respectful to be used about them. But also, if there's a technical word that is the right word to use. So we ummed and ahed about, do we talk about period poverty? Do we talk about period inequity? And actually what we're talking about is period inequity. So the first part of our report explains what is period inequity, why does it matter, and why are we using this word? And from there on, that's the word we're going to use. And so I think there is a real kind of role that charities have in being that education piece if people are coming across an issue for the first time. I think the other piece I'd add is about using existing frameworks. And again, I'm thinking about conversations we've had in the past, Elizabeth, about the UN SDGs and the various views across sectors, but particularly in our sector, of how helpful they are or aren't in terms of the language. I have a huge respect and affection for the SDGs, but they can feel, because they're global targets, they can feel a bit abstract. And we've talked about, how do you make it real for people, particularly in those smaller and medium-sized charities where you could have one person doing 10 different things. So we speak again to our corporate partners. We find out what language are they using, what's going to make the task easier for them to sell the support internally. If we're talking to a partner that's been with us and giving us product at a certain level for a long time, what do they need to be able to sell to double that level of donation, to triple that level of donation, to go from it being ad hoc to being a monthly commitment of a really needed product that our network needs? And that's where we start moving into the language of talking about ESG, sustainability, and the SDGs. And it's a lovely mix of acronyms there for whoever's watching this. But for example, you could look at UN SDG 3, which is all about well-being and health, and read a really long blurb that sounds quite abstract and very focused on global issues. But it's about preventable deaths. It's about access to healthcare. It's about giving people autonomy in how they access that healthcare. And then suddenly you're like, oh, okay. So you start to see how devices and connectivity and digital skills give people that autonomy, allow them to access the online GP appointment, allow them to access the support and the healthcare and the fitness and the overcoming isolation and all the services that amazing charities and others offer. Actually, you start to see quite quickly how you could get to preventable deaths and start talking in a way that makes sense, because you're a charity that sets up a digital skills learning class on a Thursday afternoon for a particular demographic of people. And so to be able to translate a service that's provided into something that sounds really quite kind of abstract and up there, But if you're working with corporates or you're working with funders who want to talk about the UN SDGs, being able to translate your impact into the language they're using can be incredibly helpful. So that's a very long-winded way of saying, yes, we do translate some of our information quite a lot, but we also try and be as universal as we can.
And that translation and education piece actually is incredibly important, because for a lot of people, as you say, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, they feel so distant and they feel so broad, and they don't necessarily feel like, if you're in the village hall in a rural part of Wales, are these really for you? Are they really relevant to what you're doing? But the thing is, actually, they are, because it's people who are playing the parts of actually every country being able to meet those goals. But being that facilitator, being that person in the middle who can help to actually explain those links and make those connections, there's huge value in it. I think probably a huge need across the UK, and thinking bigger across the world, but actually how we enable people to feel like they are having this big global impact, even if they're working really locally in their community. I've got a couple more questions for you, Charlotte, but just a shout out to the attendees who are here live. If you've got questions that you'd love to ask Charlotte, do pop them in that little Q&A, and we're going to come on to those shortly. I guess, Charlotte, I mean, you've reflected already on some of the key learnings that In-Kind Direct have really seen. But is there anything else that you want to share, particularly for charities who might be here today on a bit of a similar journey in how they can tackle this as well, perhaps picking up on some of the experiences that you've already been through?
Absolutely, yeah. No, I'm a firm believer on if someone else can learn the lesson for you, that's got to be better. So I've talked a little bit about our evolution from numbers to more of a storytelling approach, but we've also evolved in other ways. So historically, we would have been almost entirely reliant on ad hoc donations of surplus product that was one step from going in the bin. That's still a huge part of what we do, because these are new branded, good quality products that either there's been a change in branding, or the shop over ordered, or a campaign special offer ran through before they got through the stock. So it's perfectly good, brand new product. But what we know we came to realize is our network relies on us for that consistent, reliable supply of the most needed product. So a reliance on ad hoc surplus donations totally was not going to get where we needed to be for the impact that we wanted to have. So we started to make that shift towards more planned giving, more planned commitments. And we have a number, what we internally call our Million Club, of corporate partners who've donated 1 million of a product over the course of a year. So we've got some who have donated 1 million period products, some who donated 1 million toilet rolls, and they've sort of made that commitment up front. And that allows us to plan through the course of the year. But to be able to get those sorts of size commitments means corralling the evidence and the storytelling that we have in a way that makes it really easy for our contact at a company to go and have that conversation internally and talk about unlocking that level of support for us. It's also because we've been able to couple it with the systemic fundamental social causes that we're trying to address. So starting to make the link between what getting a laptop into the hands of someone really means from a systemic and a cause point of view, rather than just going to someone and saying we need 500 laptops. Suddenly you're kind of giving a purpose people can buy into. I think, and Elizabeth, I'm sure you'll have heard me use this phrase before, I'm a firm believer, and I think most charities with restricted resource, wanting to do 1,000,001 things, need increasing. I'm a firm believer on us knowing where do we lead, where do we support, and where do we get out of the way, because there's someone who can do this better than us. And so that really early evaluation of projects and activities, being really honest about where our strengths are and where they aren't, being really transparent. If there's pots of money we want to go for that we just can't make work, but we know that an organisation could do amazing work and we could probably work in partnership with them. So having that really early evaluation is really key. And that's definitely been a learning for us of not trying to shoehorn ourselves or contort ourselves to the point where we're not going to be able to have the impact that we want to have. And so we've got a really clear set of strategic objectives, of values that we work to, and every decision comes back to, is it going to have more impact? Is it going to meet these strategic objectives? But when it comes to communicating impact about our programs, I've probably got kind of a list of about sort of 3 or 4, I don't know if I'd be grandiose to call them top tips, certainly stuff I've learned the hard way, I would say, is probably the easier way to put it. And I think a lot of it resonates around whether you're talking about social impact, we have very similar conversations when we're talking about sustainability as well. But be honest about what you can track, and don't do nothing. Don't say nothing for fear of it not being perfect. If you know there are 6 things you wish you were tracking, but you're only tracking 3 right now, talk about those 3 and talk about your aspiration and what it would take for you to be able to track the other 3. But don't just sit in silence, because the work that we're all doing is important. So start, do something, and kind of work on the plan for how you're going to do the rest of it. I've already touched on combining stats and stories. One alone is very rarely going to do the job. So I would always say that, yeah, no stats without a story, no stories without a stat. I've touched on already, think about what your audience wants or needs to hear, not what you want to say. Use a language that works for them, but be really consistent in your tone of voice, so you can change your language, but still be authentic to the values and the framing that you use as an organization. And the last one, which was brilliant conversation we had with a couple of our corporate partners about 18 months ago, and we got some feedback on the stories we've been sharing and how we were framing things. It was really insightful, and ultimately it boils down to leave people hopeful. So we all work in a space where we're delivering essential services, generally to people who are struggling or going without or at a disadvantage. It's absolutely imperative that we talk about those issues, that we reduce the stigma, that we increase awareness, and that we quantify and say this is a big issue that needs cracking down on. So it's not about avoiding or sugarcoating, but it's about ending on a hopeful note. It's about having a call to action, suggesting a solution, suggesting something practical the person reading that can go and do, because there's nothing worse than hearing something terrible and then just being left with a ... And it's like, okay, what do I do with this now? So I would say leave people hopeful, always have a call to action at the end of anything you're communicating, because that gives people a way to share it on, but also to know there's something tangible they can do, whether that's donating 1 million toilet rolls, signing a petition, sharing something on social media, giving a cash donation, whatever it is, give people a way of helping.
Really important, actually, some really important and interesting lessons there. It can be incredibly easy, actually, to focus on the problem and to keep talking about the problem, but that hopefulness, as you describe, that's so important for people to be able to see that actually there's a way forward and they've got a part to play in that. I am sure that there will have been challenges, though, that you have faced. I'm sure it cannot have always been as easy as it possibly sounds if you're listening in on this conversation. What challenges have you faced, particularly in some of that measurement and communication? And how have you overcome some of those difficulties that you might have bumped along the way?
Yeah, I think one of the key ones on social impact, we spent probably a couple of years. We've now got to a good place, and we've had the methodology we use validated kind of outside our organization. But for a long time, the key figure that people always want is how many people are you helping? And we're very dependent on how our network reports that figure, so that when you scale it up, we can actually get to a figure for what in-kind direct is having an impact on. And we found a lot of organizations perhaps weren't fully considering the number of kind of the wider group of people who might benefit from something, and all the secondary outcomes that it might lead to, which in the case of digital and tech and devices is very often, yes, you've saved someone money of having to access a laptop, but you've done so much more than that. And when people answer your questionnaires, or they come to focus groups, or they share stories, are they thinking about all those different layers of impact that have been helped to make possible? So we came up with, through our biannual survey, so twice a year, we ask people how many people have received product, and we give some really clear examples. We ask if they're helping more people than they were at that time last year. We track the difference between those things. We get a good enough response rate that we can extrapolate that figure to give us a network figure. So right now we're supporting 445,000 people to reach the product they need each week, and that comes from extrapolated figures from our network. And we've been really clear, and we've provided guidance and support, and it's kind of, you can't expect people to know what you're asking if you're not being clear. So that's been a real lesson for us of, if we're not getting the data we want, that's our fault, that's no one else's fault. So what's the question we need to ask? What's the explanation we need to provide? And I think one of the examples we've come across as well before, Elizabeth, is when you explain that if you give a laptop to a young person, that doesn't just support that young person, it removes stress for their parents. It might mean that they can support other peers or siblings with support. It means they can then get online and socialize. So you've got all these other things that happen. And when I think about the evaluation work we did for the Tech for Schools project and some of the amazing stories that were shared, you heard about students, yes, they were able to do their coursework, but what that actually meant was they didn't have to use the library computer. And I think the story that broke my heart was they could go outside at lunchtime and make friends instead. Okay, right. So there's a piece there, and it's recognizing which things will hit best as a story and which are a stat. I don't know how you quantify the value of having the time to go and make friends. That to me will always be a story that needs to be told in addition to a stat. But a lot of what we do and a lot of the best relationships we've built, we will take partners to go and visit our network. The best people to speak about the work they do are the organizations themselves. But if we can demonstrate what one of our network partners is doing, and then we can explain to the people working with us that we supported over 5,500 organizations like that last year, you start to see the scale. And that's very much kind of one of the USPs for In-Kind Direct is the scale of what we can do. We're not claiming, as I said, to deliver those counselling services or to deliver that food bank support. But what we unlock in terms of savings for the sector, in terms of the quantity of product that we can move around, and the larger companies that want to have a one-stop solution to getting product out to thousands of communities, that's the role we can play. And if you took us away, those products wouldn't roll through, those savings wouldn't be realised, those extra services wouldn't happen. So being really comfortable in where we can lay claim to impact and where we can't has been a real learning for us, not claiming to be the totality of our network, which is completely unrealistic, but recognizing there is a very particular role that we play in allowing others to have more impact, which is just as important. So I think I've talked a little bit about the people helped was a particular challenge for us, which we've overcome through basically getting better at asking the right questions and giving people half a steer on what it is we'd like them to tell us. We also were for a long time undercounting the amount of organisations that we were supporting. So one of those big numbers that we held out any possible opportunity was a massive underestimate. And that's because we recognise that when you get local organisations where partnership and collaboration is actively encouraged, a lot of organisations were sharing product between each other to deliver projects. So if you've got a project of 20 local organisations coming together and one of them is accessing product through us, we were counting the one rather than the 20. So our solution to that was to recognise how local organisations are working, have open conversations with the corporates we worked with, because a lot of what we provide is that due diligence and confidence that product goes where it's needed. And we introduced what we call our community sharing programme, which is the ability for organisations to flag to us that they're sharing product, to collect the minimum amount of information, but be able to properly track the impact of what we're doing. And that's so we're much more confident in the figure when we talk about the organisations we're supporting, the variety of causes, the breakdown of demographics. We've got much more robust information to talk about now. So that's been hugely important to us as well. But I think, as I say, my key learnings would be transparent. If you can't track every single bit of impact you're having, that's okay. Just be transparent about what it is you can track and the stories you can tell. We've absolutely evolved the questions that we ask. I'm a firm believer if you're not getting the data you need, it's because you're asking the wrong question. It's not because people are out to get you. You just need to ask a better question. And it's about filling those data gaps with stories. So there will be some information you can get through quantitative data, stats, figures, survey responses, strongly agree, strongly disagree. There will be some things like the story of the student who was able to go out and make friends, which will always be a story. And don't worry about that. It doesn't have to be one or the other. And I would say for In-Kind Direct, the approach we generally take is we think about like what we think of as the macro and the micro. So we will tell a story, we'll tell that micro story of one person and their experience, or one organisation, what they've been able to do. And then we will quantify the scale either of the social issue or the number of organisations like that we're supporting. So people get the very individual, specific, emotive story, but they understand this is not a one-off, this is not sadly unusual, this is the scale of the issue that needs combating. So those would be certainly some of our challenges and hopefully how we overcome them.
Really fascinating, Charlotte. And yes, I mean, the Tech for Schools programme where we're just probably hours away actually from launching that the evaluation report for that. So this is a good plug to watch out for the Tech for Schools report. Some of the stories that purely came out from that, and around even visiting one of the schools with our partners. So I was there, Charlotte was there, Amazon were there, and Teach First came along as well. And meeting students who had been trying to complete GCSE and A-level coursework on phones, some of which old, bashed up, broken screens, old in the sense of not being able to get at the latest apps and have the proper security and everything that many people will take for granted, and no option to create that coursework, to create these essays, graphs, presentations that are going to be graded and therefore have this impact on what you can do in the future. Trying to do that on a phone, and then hearing about the stories of what had been opened up by providing laptops, by providing connectivity, by supporting the school. These are the things that really can show partners actually why this is so incredibly important, and achieve that without, of course, creating what we sort of refer to internally as not creating poster people for poverty, because that's the last thing we want to do through storytelling, is really stigmatize individuals. And I guess that's something you probably face a lot as well, is how you draw those through, but without focusing too much on any one individual.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a real eye opener for me, and kind of showing here, and I think I'd already shared with Elizabeth, the period equity research that we published back in February. I can't remember if I volunteered or was volunteered, or it was a combination of the two. But I have menstrual health conditions, and so I became one of the spokespeople for the research, as well as sort of sitting there with my partnerships and impact director hat doing radio. I was also sharing some of my personal experience. And honestly, I wish I could say there was some training course to go on or some amazing nugget, but being that person was the most eye-opening experience I've had. And however good we all think we might be, I thought we were about storytelling, and actually being in that position of switching from talking about the stats and the research and the recommendations and the policy piece to sharing my personal experience on radio, on video, was a hugely eye-opening experience. And it's about creating that safety, and it's about letting people use their own words. There can be a temptation to grammar check and to kind of neutralize wording that people use, but actually the words people choose to use are incredibly important. So I think that would be one of my key things, definitely. Of a lot of it comes down to, and again, I'm data protection background, so consent, unsurprisingly, is hugely important to me. But it is a lot about informed consent, people understanding exactly what the story is going to be used for, how long it's going to be used for, where they might see it. Am I going to walk into a local supermarket and see this on a billboard, or is it going to be on a social media post or a platform I'm not registered with? Actually just being really open, and again, being transparent about where that story will be used, and trying as much as possible to keep it in people's own words is hugely important.
It really is, both for authenticity and also for themselves. They've chosen those words to use for a reason. We're going to come on to a couple of the questions from people listening to the session. So the first one is, do you feel any pressure to provide resources more for one beneficiary group over another? So for example, children or asylum seekers or pensioners. How do you combat the exclusion of some over others?
I think that's a really excellent and fundamental question that I'm sure lots of people on this Zoom call are facing every day. I wouldn't say we feel pressure. I think certainly we've had some interesting conversations with companies in recent years. We had a lot of, we want to help children, we want to help school children, or it's cold, it's winter, we want to help people who are experiencing homelessness. And that's not the phrase they use, but that's the phrase we use. And I think there's in being a trusted partner, it gives you the ability, as I come back to that piece about educating people. So we would have a lot of conversations of, well, we want to reach kids, so how many schools do you work with? And we would explain the myriad other ways that school-age children and their families are engaged with through a whole mix of types of organisation. So for us, we're able to, because we're working that one step removed, working with organisations rather than the individuals directly, we are able to use it as an opportunity to educate. Actually, if you want to reach this particular group, you would do it through pretty much every organisation in our network. And certainly during the pandemic, we had, for example, kids hand washing initiatives. And so we were just really open with our network that this is the aim of the project. If you need sanitizer for something else, go look over here where we've got the stock. But actually, if you're working with school age children, this is an initiative you can engage with. And there's a real openness to that. And I think there can be a danger of almost, dare I say, cutting off your nose to spite your face. We would rally against, as I said, contorting ourselves to fit a very niche particular funding requirement or corporate request. But if there is good that can be done, which doesn't force us to reimagine too much, but it means helping a particular group rather than anyone and everyone, we will absolutely consider it. We will look at the impact we could have with that support. We will look at the good that it could do in the wider world. And it would spur the team internally on to go and find equivalent sources of resource and support for other groups as well. I think there's no denying every time we do UK polling, we speak to our network, we speak to sector partners, there are particular groups that are particularly affected by particular causes. So, for example, when we looked at a kind of broader hygiene poverty, if you are living in a household with a child who has a disability, you are, I think, 3 times as likely to be experiencing hygiene poverty. So for us, there would be a very clear case. If someone approached us and said, we want to work with this particular group, there would be a very clear logic for us to say, well, yes, of course, because we can make impact there. We would always open a conversation of, does it need to be exclusively that group? Could it be kind of a prioritization of that group, but helping as many people as possible? Or is it really fixed on just working with a particular group? And often when you get to a level of restriction that is, no, it absolutely has to be this, it's for a reason that is beyond that organization, that company, that funder's control. There's a restriction being passed down from somewhere else. Because if it's just a wish list of a company, getting into the conversation of, well, did you know you could also do this? We could think about this. You could broaden it in this way. You could prioritize this, but you could also reach this. If the restriction isn't really genuine, that conversation happens quite quickly. Oh, I didn't realize that. Yeah, okay, let's do this. Whereas if a funder goes, no, it's got to be, I don't know, women over 35 in Greater Manchester, that's a restriction that's come from somewhere else. So I think, yeah, in summary, we would always encourage breadth wherever possible, but where we can see a logic to focus on a particular group, and where we think we can have impact, we would absolutely do that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Charlotte. And I think probably one more question that's going to be a bit of a segue for how people can get involved. So Violet has asked how you guys maybe work with volunteers to promote awareness of digital poverty specifically. So it'd be great to hear about that. And then also, if you've got a little call to action for anybody else who might be on the call, that would be great to hear too.
Brilliant. It's interesting. Volunteers don't play a huge, well, that's a lie. They don't play a fundamental role for In Kind Direct. We are a small staff team. Where volunteers come into their own is in volunteering at our warehouse, or where we can make links with our network partners who are looking for particularly corporate volunteers. So there's definitely a role there where we can provide that linking. We play quite a convening, connecting role, so getting groups of people together who would not otherwise be meeting and speaking to each other. So there's definitely a role for volunteers if they want to come to our warehouse and visit our website and find out all about that, if you're from a corporate or from a charity. And if you're a charity that wants to join our network and has a particular need, we're always interested to hear that. We would also signpost to other great organisations like Business in the Community, who do a lot of corporate volunteer matching. When I think about the one takeaway from today, I think it would be kind of probably similar to things I've said on other topics, is don't be scared to say something just because it's not perfect. If you're authentic and it's transparent and you're clear on what it is you can track, say something, because whatever service you're delivering as a charitable organisation in particular, your voice will add value to the wider conversation. And if it's something that you don't feel comfortable to do, then get your evidence, get your story to organisations like Digital Poverty Alliance, like In Kind Direct, where we can talk in aggregate about what is going on across the country. But I would just say, yeah, be transparent, be respectful and truthful to the people, particularly if they're sharing their stories with you. But just shout loudly. I think that a lot of what we've got to say needs to be heard.
Thank you, Charlotte. That has been a fantastic session, and so many insights there, I hope, for our attendees and audience on the recording later to take away, because I think there's so much to learn from there. If you have enjoyed today's session and it's told you some things that you didn't know, do visit the In Kind Direct website, as Charlotte said earlier, to read some of their reports and research, so much of which is just freely available on the website. So do make sure that you take a look at that. Do also visit digitalpovertyalliance.org, and there you can do a whole load of things. You can read our National Delivery Plan 2023-2024 edition coming out very soon in June, so watch out for that as well. If you don't follow us on social media, please do. You can find us on all major platforms, and I think Imi is very kindly going to put some links in the chat to help you find us right now. And of course, if you appreciate the work that we're doing, we would love you to visit our website and make a donation. Every donation counts, whether that is in terms of fundraising or whether it is in terms of kit or connectivity support for some of the people that we work with. That can be incredible. Thank you again, Charlotte. Thanks so much for your time today. Thank you to everyone for joining us live, and we will see you again soon. Take care. Bye.